Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
And welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight I am joined by Mr. Jeff Ritzmann.
Hello there.
And Joshua Cutchin.
Good evening. Good time to be in good company.
And for this show, we're going to talk about a close encounter UFO case. And Jeff, you brought this one up and said you wanted to talk about it, so why don't you tell people a little bit about it and why it interests you?
Oh. Wow. That put me on the spot, didn't it?
It did.
Glad I brought this up. Actually, the Ariel UFO case, Ariel in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, from '94, and I bring it up only because there's a film that's been in the making now from what I gather, is years of development to get this documentary made, not only about the event itself, but also catching up with the people who were children then, today as adults. How are they faring with the experience that they had and all that? So I've been pretty much, since it came to public light, I've known about it. I've been reading about it and watching every bit of footage that I could of the interviews with kids, both with John Mack and not. So, I mean, this was September 16th in 1994 in Zimbabwe. And it was a place called the Ariel School, which was like a private elementary school. Interesting enough for students with mixed racial heritage. So this was African kids, British kids. I mean, it was across the board. And the students were anywhere from 5 to 12 years old. So it's an elementary school, essentially. I mean, that's what this was. And the kids were out at morning recess. And I guess the best way to put it, when you're talking about a school in Zimbabwe, you're talking about there are areas cleared of brush and tree to put your buildings on, and then to have a schoolyard in. And I think we were talking about anywhere from close to 250 children at this school. And so they're out at morning recess, and there are, if you look at any video on YouTube, they'll give you a decent kind of view of what it looked like in the schoolyard. So you've got big areas of open ground around the buildings that are essentially dirt. And then outside of that is brush and thicket grass and shrubs of every kind of going out further. Now, the kids were not allowed to go into those shrubs-like areas because they wanted to keep the kids into clear areas. And so the kids were out playing morning recess, and they started to see flashes in the sky. And then basically started to see objects. And it's hard to give a really definitive account of what was seen when and by who, because you're talking about 60 kids out of 250 who actually saw this event.
It's almost a full quarter of the enrollment,
Right. So you're talking about a lot of kids. Some of them were more of a distance from the event than others, and so the perception's different in what they saw and what angle they saw it and when they began to witness the event. But as near as I can make out, there were these as many as 3 silver sphere-like objects seen in the sky that would disappear in one spot and reappear in another spot in the sky, and they did this repeatedly, kind of jumping from one point to another. And began to move lower to the ground from certain vantage points that the kids were looking at. These things kind of materialized and dematerialized and moved in the air until they arrived at the ground. And when they became visible to them nearest the ground, it was clear that one of these things was a disc-shaped object. Now, some say that there was just the disc, but more kids out of that 60 seemed to say that there were other objects around it. that also were silver. And these things never really touched the ground. They kept the distance above the shrubbery, but they could see these glints between the trees and between the shrubs of this silver object. Other kids reported a disc with a kind of a bell-shaped housing on the top, with lights around the edge, and the little objects dotted around it. So, again, this is an area forbidden for students to go. It was around 100 meters, which I think is a little over 300 feet away from them. And they saw beings, 2 of them. And this is where, to me, this story, this case in general, seems to take the turn where you say, and I've said this about a lot of cases that involve a typical UFO report that then takes on this eerie air of bizarreness. I mean, beyond what you would expect to hear, even with leading questions, which happened in this case. And the kids saw one being standing in front or sitting on the edge of the disc. It's unclear when these beings showed up. In other words, the disc is there, the objects are around the disc on the ground. It seems to be live and hot on the ground, and yet now there are these beings, one sitting on the edge, the other one described as running up and down the edge of the disc, over top, back down, over top, back down, in slow motion. They were what we would deem to be gray aliens, big black eyes. Some described them as wraparound eyes with long black hair, which I don't think is that frequently reported in this stuff, but is getting more prevalent, I think, in probably the past 10 or 15 years. And so the idea that one is running back and forth over top of this object, I think, is interesting. And then the one began to sort of make its way towards the kids, took some steps towards them. There does seem to be, I think, by I don't know. It's tough to say because, when you talk about the investigation itself, a lady named Cynthia Hind was the first one on the scene. She was the local investigator of UFOs. She had done a lot of casework before there in Africa.
Yeah, she was the publisher of UFO Afro News, if I recall correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
And but if you watch her interviewing some of these kids on video, there's a hell of a lot of contamination that's going on because they're talking to these 4 kids on a couch in the headmaster's office, and yet the door is wide open and there are throngs of children outside listening.
Well, and even John Mack, I'm like, don't get me wrong, as far as sort of the core 3 abduction researchers that I think of that sort of form the phenomena, Mack's sort of at the top of that list, even though it sort of makes you, the skinniest kid at fat camp. But even John was, was sort of leading kids in their testimony a little bit too. Yeah. If you watch videos of that.
Sure. Yeah. And that right there is problematic were it not for what I think was probably a smart move on Cynthia's part, which was when she got the call from the headmaster that maybe you should come out and talk to these kids. She said, tell you what, sit them all down, have them draw what they saw. This is the day after the event. And so back to the sighting itself, this being begins to walk towards the children, and there does seem to be I don't want to say missing time because I hate that terminology, but there seems to be missing time.
Or a time distortion.
Or at least a dilation of some kind where the kids really can't, even today, even by today's standards as adults, they can't seem to say how long this took. They can't seem to say for how long they saw this thing walking towards them. It's not quite missing time. It wasn't like they appeared in one spot and then appeared in another, or felt like they had moved or done something. It was just there doesn't seem to be a lot of consensus on how long this all took. But the way it was described was that as he came towards them, there was some kind of communication between this thing and a lot of the kids. Everything from technology is great, but you guys are using it wrong. You need to be more careful with your technology, to ecological matters of taking care of the planet, and the same sort of fare that we've heard before from experiencers in time and memoriam. When it comes to that,
someone was saying, though, that stuff didn't come out during the first interviews, but only after Dr. Mack talked to them.
Correct. So initially it was technologies, too much technologies too fast, that sort of thing. The ecological matters came in discussions with Mac. Now, we don't have all the footage of Mac interviewing these kids. We have no idea how much that he kind of tipped into them about this. And let's not forget that Mac didn't show up for 2 months after this event was already done. So I have to go by what footage we have of Miss Hind doing her interviews with the boys and girls, like literally within a matter of days after the event, and certainly the drawings done the day after. But there are notions of some kind of communication going on of different sorts. A lot of the kids were just plain out scared, as one would be. But it was said that essentially when he, meaning the being, noticed the kids could see him, he disappeared and reappeared in the back of the craft in quotes. So that's interesting. That's an odd thing for a kid to say. I mean, again, you're talking about kids 5 to 12 years old. This is not, I think it's safe to say these kids probably weren't all that familiar with UFO things, and least of all high strangeness at that point in 94, to be able to say things like what they were scared of.
Right.
In one interview, a little girl couldn't have been more than 6, 7 years old. She said, "I was scared." And they said, "Well, what scared you?" And she said, "The sound." And this is where I say, yes, Mac in his questioning did present things, to, in other words, he said to, "Well, what kind of sound was it? Was it a rumble, a hum, a buzz?" And she said, "No, it sounded like somebody playing a flute."
Yeah. Yeah, I love that.
So you can lead, and if a kid has seen something, to my mind, they'll go, "No, it was this." That little girl was very much in control of her own answers, in my opinion, just watching that.
Yeah.
And how she verbalized how scared she was. And her voice was trembling, clearly. But again, you wonder how much of that emotion is from remembering it, and how much of it is there's cameras here, and who else is standing behind that camera watching? Am I giving a book report in front of the whole class? That kind of nervousness. You just don't know. But again, these kids, they seemed very forthright about what they were saying to Cynthia in her recordings of them. Some kids did claim to have seen something odd in the sky on the 15th, the day before, but they didn't say anything about it because they had fear of being made fun of. And a lot of the kids then, after this whole thing came to light, it became a story. A lot of them reported that they had gotten teased by other classmates and by adults even. Some of their parents didn't believe them. They had to talk to the headmaster. The headmaster said they saw something. I don't know what it was, but they saw something. So anyway, essentially the event ends when the beings disappear. The thing rises up off the ground a slight bit and disappears. The smaller objects apparently rose only about 1 meter off the ground, whereas the other thing apparently went higher. The main body went higher and disappeared. The other things lifted up 1 meter and vanished. So it's appropriate enough to freak somebody out, that sort of thing. But I think what interests me a little bit in a couple of directions is not only the high strangeness part of it, but I think there's a lot to be learned on how do we talk to children about these kind of events, because I do think children are privy to a lot more of these things than adults are, which is something I've thought for a long time. And go ahead.
I was just going to say that's something that, I'm like, my next book is about paranormal child abduction. So obviously I'm like, up to my eyeballs in this sort of thing. And that's a very common idea that children are more privy to this. But like the reason why I feel like is on one hand sort of reasonable, but on the other hand sort of hackneyed. It's the idea that, children's minds are more malleable. And that's the reason that they perceive this stuff. But at the same time, if you look at the ideas of some behavioral theorists, like I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who suggested that human development is different from adult development because. Or human development rather different than animal development because we actually have more time to ingest and sort of dissect and become acquainted with the natural world during a prolonged childhood actually gives us sort of a benefit over sort of the animalistic model, which I think is probably the closest that you can find to sort of a biological reason for why children are more impressionable. Because if you look at the animal kingdom and stuff like the experiment where they take chickens for 3 generations who aren't exposed to the outside world and still see a shadow pass over them and freak out as if a hawk were passing over. That seems ingrained, and we don't seem to have that. But at the same time, we seem to have a capacity to internalize this sort of odd other. And I wonder if, like, I don't know if there's a scientific basis for this old trope of children's minds being more malleable, but like my gut instinct seems to suggest that's the case.
I mean, to me, there seems to be like a more obvious angle to that, which is that more malleable, yes, impressionable, yes, but also I think there's the kind of the tangent reason for that is they haven't been told no. In other words, you mentioned the shadow coming over the animal and to run for your life because there's a shadow over the animal, and it could be a hawk or it could be an eagle or what have you coming in to swoop up. Well, we have adults in our midst who will say, "There's no such thing. You don't have to worry about this. There is no such thing as that." But when you're a kid, unless you're told from the get-go, there's no such thing as monsters. Guess what? There be monsters.
Right.
And so, to me, that seems a rather big thing because, at least in my experience, it's like there seems to be enough of a subtext on this thing that requires belief on the part of a witness, or at least an openness to experience. And so, kids are open to all sorts of experiences. I don't think it's just relegated to this paranormal thing. I think they've also all kids, I think, have a creative bend that either develops over time into adulthood or it goes.
Well, and it's that old chestnut of the idea that children in a foreign country absorb a language and learn it quickly, or quicker than adults, rather.
Correct. Yeah. Because there's nothing saying you can't.
Yeah, exactly.
And you haven't got the the cynical notion of anymore that I'm not going to be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. There's not that internalized voice, right. The internalized naysayer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You don't have that as a little kid. I mean, you could do anything. And I always think back to my son taking Taekwondo and him getting in front of like the grandmaster of Taekwondo from Korea, and I thought, God, he's got to be nervous. And I was like, weren't you nervous, Cody? And he goes, why would I be nervous? They don't know.
There's a loose correlation between that and the very real phenomena of beginner's luck. Because
Yeah.
when you're a beginner at something, you try it out and you don't have any sort of ego getting in the way, and you just try it, and usually generally the id, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
takes over and allows you to accomplish what you want to do. And then the more you think about it, the more you get your ego involved, the harder it gets.
Right. Yeah. And so, kids are sponges. They're sponges, and they are open to so many things. And I think the amazing part about listening to these kids talk about this, especially in the beginning, and some of the footage with Mac doing the questioning, where he's not really leading too awful much. It's just kind of what happened next. I mean, you do with kids. I know with my own, when he was 5, 6 years old, and he would go to kindergarten or what have you, I'd say, "What'd you do at school today?" Played. With who? With what? What did you literally had to drag it out of them. Before that, all they want to do is talk to you. Like we teach them to talk, and then they talk, and we go, "Will you please just sit back and be quiet while we're going to the store?" And then when they go to school, you want to know what happened, and then they don't want to talk anymore. So half of me says, well, here's a guy, he specializes in child psychology, so he would know how to talk to a kid. But at the same time, I think there might have been some life rings kind of thrown out there that a kid, if he was kind of struggling for the words, could grab onto. But what's interesting about this, when he began talking to them about what was conveyed to them, what scared you about him? The eyes looked evil. Well, do you believe he was evil? She said no. And yet the notion of kind of even apocalyptic scenery going by in the mind, which is not something this kid had thought about before, apparently. He said, did any of this occur to you before this event, or had you always thought about these things? And she said, no, I never had, but now I do. And he said, well, how did he said, stay with me here. How did he convey these things to you? How did it get from him to you? How did that thought come? And the only answer the girl gave was, after a long pause, was the eyes.
Yeah.
The kid didn't even know how to say, he made it show up in my head, or it was a knowing, or however you would explain that. Which is totally what I would expect a kid to be befuddled about, and just say the eyes. That totally seems consistent with me, with somebody who is not aware of the vocabulary enough to describe the action that they underwent. So that alone is really, really interesting stuff. The fact that this is a multicultural school is also a really interesting little wrinkle. And I've looked for a long time for what might have been going on in that area during this. Like what might have preceded, what might have surrounding it, and there was so much going on in that area at that time, but I'm more interested in, was there construction going on? Was there governmental upheaval? Was there, all of these things. And there are certainly some things that would fit the bill, but I'm looking for very specific things, which I haven't found yet. So, as I said, the kids were scared to death due to the weird appearance and noise. But one other interesting wrinkle that came up in the questioning was what some kids said they got from the one staring at them, and two in particular stood out to me. One said something along the lines of, it seemed like he would like to take us.
Yeah.
And I think Max said something along the lines like, did he want you to go with you, or want you to go with him? And she said, no, take us. He would take us. And another one said that she got kind of like, she tried to impersonate like a sort of maniacal look on her face, and she said like, I'm going to get you, or you're coming with me, or something like that. And so there's that, which I think, figures into the, the folkloric fae folk and all that sort of thing. That also seems to be a commonality that's developed over the years, that walk through the purple door with me and never be seen again. So, and another interesting effect that was, as near as I can tell, reported by more of the boys than the girls. Now, whether or not that's true or not, again, I don't know because I don't have every piece of footage shot of every single interview. But what I can gather from what is out there is that several of the girls felt a heart racing and then a heart slowing down repeatedly in sequence. Speed up, slow down, speed up, slow down. Whereas a lot of the boys, one described a feeling of being wizzy. Disorientation is what I take that as. And that one of those same kids, boys that had said that he had to avert his gaze from the being because it made him feel like he was going to faint.
Right.
So I find that interesting as well. At some point I heard Cynthia Hinn say something along the lines of that there was missing time elements to this, and she wanted to discuss the matter with a hypnotist. Hopefully that didn't happen.
Yeah,
I don't know.
see, the missing time element, I don't
find it like missing time in the classic sense to me.
Well, I mean, like there were teachers in a faculty meeting who saw the swarm of kids coming towards them. So
right.
Theoretically, if there was missing time in the traditional sense, there should have been one kid who staggered in 5 hours later. Like
exactly.
I don't quite get that connection.
Right. I'm thinking a dilation of some kind. That there is this. I think there's a loss of the sense of how long was it there and how long were they staring at this. I get the sense that they can't really put an amount of time on that.
I think that there is a widely connecting, overlapping Venn diagram between the way that we perceive car crashes as being longer than they really are, and the way that we perceive anomalous events as being shorter than they are. I think that, like, yes, there's something weird going on there, but also it has to do with the fact that, like, our perception of time really is directly influenced by the things that we are observing, in terms of how familiar or how horrific or like what sort of state we need to be in. I think it says something about the fact that if we perceive anomalous events as being shorter than they truly are, I think that it says something specific about what that state is, as opposed to a fight or flight sort of state, which you normally perceive as being longer than it really was.
Right.
It seems like almost the inverse of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the interesting part is that, there was no adult witnesses to this at all. 250 kids, 60 see this, not one adult. And there was an adult in basically like a little hut where they had snacks and whatnot for the kids. That there was an adult in there. There was a parent, actually, of one of the kids in there.
Oh, yeah,
and that was the first place they ran.
Yeah.
And she said, I can't leave the snack hut.
I was ran to the snack hut in elementary school too, so it's okay.
And I can't leave the snack hut. You'll have to go in the school. And so, a lot of the teachers believed these kids right off the bat. She said, I mean, a couple of the teachers had said, if we tried to plan 60 kids to come running to us in a panic, if they had made something up, you couldn't do it. You couldn't get any of them to agree on anything. And by and large, these kids agreed from their own perspective, from their own vantage points. There was a lot of interesting things seen. The further back you got, it seemed that they lost sight of, they mentioned these enormous eyes. Every kid, enormous eyes. But yet some kids who seemed to be further back in the group, and there was talk by these kids of, I can't see, move, I can't see. Why? So they were clearly coagulated in a loose form around what was going on, as near as they could get to it without stepping outside of the area that's designated for them to be in. So they did not encroach on an area they weren't supposed to be. There was this notion of, well, I couldn't see their face. He said, well, a lot of the kids are saying that they had really big eyes. The one said, well, I can tell you, it just looked like a flat sheet of paper to me. There were no features.
Right.
So I find that really interesting.
Well, and might I read some Ritzmann writing on the wall, and the fact that there is this boundary between where they should be and where they shouldn't be. That perhaps
don't jump ahead, Josh.
sorry, I missed the script
No. You're absolutely right. I mean, essentially in an area that was forbidden for the children to go.
Yeah,
you know.
I mean, it's once you start looking for these hallmarks, it's like clockwork.
I'm telling you.
I think it's interesting. That, like, when you look at the videos, I mean, my folks are in town, so we watched some videos on the case beforehand, just to sort of refamiliarize myself with it, because I was familiar with it. But my folks said, "Wow, there are a lot of like colonial white kids in Zimbabwe."
Right. Yeah.
Which I think also speaks to that sort of. I mean, this is not a homogenous group of children.
No, definitely not.
It's very much a mixed group of Africans and African colonial children as well, and I think that speaks to sort of. I think that's interesting in two ways. I think it speaks to sort of, again, the sort of I don't know if homogeny or sort of heterogeny, I guess, is the equivalent of liminality, because it sort of represents two groups intermingling. But setting that aside, whether or not I might be right on that, it's interesting to me that two traditionally culturally different groups would see the same thing, which, like, honestly, the whole gray alien mythos, and this is a gross reduction, but it seems to me to be like one of the widest American phenomena ever. If you look at sort of what indigenous cultures or African American cultures tend to experience in their interactions with the other, it's not this Whitley Strieber-esque,
right,
gray alien thing. And yet here we are in, the heart of sort of South Eastern Africa, if my geography is correct. You're experiencing this very sort of American westernized thing, and I almost wonder if that's not a cultural contamination from these colonial children. Sorry, I set up like 5 or 10 things in that.
No. I think that and I'm trying to remember what the name is, a really combobulated name, but there is I'm guessing some kind of folkloric figure in African culture that steals children.
I mean, there are plenty of analogies. I mean, you can talk about, like, the Tokolosh. There's another set of like short sort of fae folk characters that are known for I believe it's called the abattoir from the Zulu tribe.
Okay.
Or sort of insect-sized, but like occasionally abducted children.
Yeah,
So
a lot of the African children, that's what they thought. I mean, when they went in, they thought it was this demon from African culture that steals children.
Yeah, probably. Given the proximity to South America, probably the Tokolosh.
That sounds right to me for some reason, but that's probably it. And that's what a lot of the kids thought. I mean, the facade, who knows where the facade came from, but they did report largely the same looking thing. But to me, I look at this and I go, 1994, apartheid ended in 91. Got to be a lot of tension there, right? I mean, this is not just it's not your average, I think, elementary school. This is a mixed cultural heritage elementary school, where it's not just adults interacting, but now we're going to put our children into these non-segregated schools and see what happens. So I think I think if you want to look at it from the standpoint of cultural Africa, whether it be colonialist or not, there's certainly some sort of taboo or perceived societal taboo happening there with the integration of African children and colonial English children.
I mean, yeah, I mean, like paging, in terms of our Where Did the Road Go cinematic universe podcast situation, paging, Ren Collier's idea of, cultural turmoil in the Soviet Union leading to the, the humanoid flap around that time.
Uh-huh.
Also the weirdness in America right now, which I think is kind of approaching new heights that we haven't seen in probably about 20 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that cultural times of not even negative upheaval, but just let's use a Ritzmann term here, anti-structural.
Yeah,
or an upset of the status quo. I think that sort of feeds into these things. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point on your part.
Absolutely, it does. I mean, it's so there's and God knows what else. What was the climate of the school? We don't know, because at the time these questions weren't asked. I think nowadays, if this were happening today, I'd like to think that at least somebody of our collective would say, let's talk to these teachers. What were the teachers like? How did they feel about teaching at this school? And presumably they supported such a thing, or they wouldn't have been there. But what was the community like that surrounded that school? Was there negative thoughts kind of focused on that school? Was there controversy about that school? What was it like? I mean, I have no idea. We can guesstimate, but that's not good enough. So things like that would be really interesting to know. And as I said, this film is being made. I feel like they're making strides towards getting it completed. It's been a long time coming, and I know they've had fundraisers to fund it, which I believe are done now.
Now is it a documentary or
it is? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a documentary, and basically they're covering the event itself, but then they're also going back to some of these children that you see in the widely seen videos on YouTube being interviewed. They're interviewing them now as adults. How has this affected you? Now, here's point 2 to all this. We've got this really good event. I mean, this is good to me. No, there's no photographs. There are drawings. Yes, those drawings are different. And as Jeremy pointed out to me in an email earlier this week, he made the point, well, it's odd that so many of the kids that, some of the drawings look the same, but a lot of them look different. Why do they look different? And I know from teaching kids art for so long that essentially this is not uncommon. Kids draw from essentially from the heart. They don't always draw for accuracy. In fact, in the documentary at one point, they come back to the school a year and a half later and they do a recap with the kids, and they said, Susie, why is your object orange? Because yours seems to be different from everyone else's. Why is yours orange? And she said, because there wasn't any silver crayons left. So I think we got to kind of take into consideration that. But we also have to take into consideration that kids depict things emotionally. Sometimes the younger they are, the more emotional they try to derive their things. But when it came to the older kids, the ones who are a little bit more, I guess, they realized the impact of this event a little bit more than the younger kids did. Theirs were all fairly consistent with the size and shape, the general canopy on the top with some lights around the edge. But in the grand sense, we've got an interesting case. It's really compelling. It's got high strangeness. It's got all the anti-structural elements, the liminal elements. It's got everything you could want. So I'm just going to point this out. So did Rendlesham. Don't lean back on our chairs yet, folks, because you never know what can happen. and so have a lot of other cases throughout time. They've held up so well until attention starts to be paid to them in the modern day, and then things seem to happen. Case in point, there's a lady now who is one of the first, as near as I can tell, people to publicly speak, right, about this as an adult. And I don't have her name written down, and I wish I'd have written it down. Straight red hair, a pretty lady. I mean, seems very sweet, seems very honest, seems very seems to be speaking from a place of humility about this. Doesn't seem to be trying to capitalize on anything. If you look it up on YouTube, you'll find her pretty quickly. It'll say something about 20 years later, one of the first contact people, they speak about this. And you'll notice that, number one, she's very nervous, which is not unexpected speaking to a large group of UFO folks, right? But what I find interesting about this is that when she's asked questions by the audience, she always makes eye contact with the man who's there, who is apparently investigating her specific case, her specific effects from this case. She looks to him almost at every question that she's asked. Like, should I answer this? What should I say? How should I say this? I don't like that. I've never liked that, because in the UFO field, we often get what I call handlers, because that's what they are. These are people who essentially will sequester a witness away from the public in order to either secure the book rights or to secure that person if they're nervous about, I don't want to be approached by every UFO nut on the planet, a la Travis Walton, right? Travis was besieged with, serious researchers and your general, person that you wouldn't send to the corner store to buy milk, as Terrence would say. Everybody in between. So I can protect you from that. We'll make sure that, there's gatekeepers to this sort of thing. I mentioned Dorothy Izod on a previous program here. I found that to be true in her case to a large degree. Her family basically surrounds her. She does not directly contact anyone, and you cannot contact her. It's very difficult to get a hold of Dorothy Izod. She is in her 80s, I think, after all, so I'm not surprised about that. But I find it interesting, her demeanor in answering the questions. It was very odd. But again, she said some odd things. Number one, she has seen or had experiences since this event. Whereas, again, to refer to people like Travis Walton or other people in these multi-witness events, he claims not to have.
Actually, that's not totally true.
Really? Has he come out and said now?
No. But when I talked to him, that was one of the main questions I had for him.
Us too.
And he basically said that he doesn't want to distract from the other case.
Okay.
So he did not specify what has happened to him, because I was also asking him about things like electromagnetic effects and things like that. And he didn't really want to get into it. Someone else there who knew him made the comment that, yeah, he'll short out computers very easily and so on and so forth. And that they hinted that, he may have had a few other encounters. Actually, I think they may talk about it in the Q&A I put up for Patreons from the film premiere. But I would bet he's had other experiences. They probably weren't on the same level.
Yeah.
But he just doesn't want to start it all over again.
See, that's odd, because I think on Paratopia, I'm reasonably sure when we asked him that, it was no.
Well, that's his official answer is no.
Yeah.
But I suspect that's not entirely true.
Well, we did too. I think at the time, I think maybe even after chat, Jeremy and I said, I don't know that I buy that. But nevertheless, I'm not hearing from a lot of the other adult witnesses saying that they've had other things. I mean, one gentleman who was one of the boys, the older boys, I believe, said that he really hasn't wanted to talk about it. It's always been in his head, but he hasn't really wanted to talk about it, and he hasn't up to now. Another one's mother, who I'm guessing he's an adult, but they spoke to his mother, and she said he's never stopped talking about it. He's mentioned it every day since it happened.
Yeah, but I wonder sometimes too if like it's not one of those rising tides lifts all ships scenarios. I mean, obviously, not every child among the 60 was, poised to become Reiki practicing shaman. I mean,
Right. Right.
So I wonder if perhaps there's some sort of like groupthink that takes hold. That sort of allows it to be, again, stealing from you, Ren, sort of a contagion amongst the group.
Yeah, and this is what predominantly worries me about now. I mean, we've got what was said back then. I always go back to the 0 point for any case. I want to hear what was said right after the event happened. And whether or not you got all the information or not, irrelevant to me. It'd be great if you did, but if you didn't, I'm still going to go back to that original line of questioning, because I fear that this case will be. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm just saying I fear that this case will be tainted by what these people say today. In other words, will there? And I feel inevitably there will be people who say, "Well, I didn't say anything back then," but
yeah,
and there'll be something else that'll come up that'll be that you will be able to tell, just will not sit right, aka binary codes. Et cetera, and so on and so forth. It may be that easy to discern, but nevertheless, I mean, memory is not a videotape. And over the years, if you've not consciously tried to do it, the mind will build. This is what happens. You talk to people like Dr. Lilienfeld from Emory University. He'll tell you it's not a memory machine. Over time, things will drop away, or other things may be added to. And after a while, it's hard to discern these things from what actually did happen.
Yeah, if you've ever told a big lie, this is the case, because you know what I mean. After a while, you start to tell it again and again and again, and then you end up sort of kind of misremembering what your truth.
And there's also the aspect of like what I think happened with Rendlesham, and I know not everybody's going to agree with me, but odd that these things came to light during the 30th year anniversary. None of these things were important until that point. Then they were important. And that case to me now is always going to live with there was always a large amount of ambiguity with that case, that you just didn't know what exactly was going on with what person at what time. There was a set schedule of events and set responses to the stimulus, but certain people, I mean, Larry Warren was one that there was a muck up in that. There were some points of John Burroughs things that's not quite clear, and then there's hypnosis thrown on top of that, and what a mess, right? So are we ever going to be able to look at that case again and not think about, binary codes and time travelers and all this kind of stuff, like or high Brazil? Are we ever going to be able to escape that stink of that? And I say no. That's now become a part of that to me was the quintessential example in ufology of modern myth making. This is what happened with Roswell as well. I mean, Roswell probably was, some interesting but probably mundane event that then took on this mythic quality, and over time, I guarantee you, 10 years from now, Rendlesham will not look like what Rendlesham looks like now. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah, well, you also have Peter Robbins pretty much disowning all his work on it and saying, Larry Warren lied about a lot of stuff, and I can't even tell you what was lie and what was true.
Right. I mean, so my fear is with the Ariel case, it's such an interesting case. It's got all the interesting parts that you could want. Is there a lack of information about things? Sure. Can some of that stuff be kind of fleshed out? Most likely, if you just look at local newspapers, probably you can discern what the cultural air might have been at the time, and that might prove to be something interesting. And I'm sure if I talked to George Hansen about it, he'd point out things that I'm like oblivious to, and he'd go, "Well, you don't see these things? What are you, crazy?" But there's certainly interesting things, and I would be curious to know. Only because this was brought up to me recently about, where does all of this end? Which is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, with the whole question of what are we after here? In this case, kind of exemplifies that to me. Like, what are we after? What do we want to know? And what if what we want to know isn't really what we want to know? In other words, what if the answer we get wouldn't really be what we want? Right. Which is often the case that I bring up to people who say, we want disclosure, that mythical thing. Well, what if the disclosure is not what you want it to be? And so with this, I go, well, where does this end? Where do we want to be with any of this? And in the end, what you want to do, or what I think you would want to do, is start looking at broader and broader pictures, just as I step back and you look at anti-structure and the things that surround paranormal events and go, see these consistencies? Aren't these interesting? Like, what can we do with these? That's all I try to do. What you can try to do is apply that to what's going on in a broader sense, like what's going on politically, what's going on in the ebb and flow of humanity and culture and everything else. And are there patterns in the larger picture? And you find some interesting stuff when you do that.
Well, that's part of the old Jeffrey Kripal chestnut, is that, the mark of a bad comparativist is to say, well, Fatima looks like a UFO, so it must be a UFO, or to say UFOs look like Fatima, so it must be a Christ-like apparition.
Right.
Right. But two things that really struck me. So first of all, and I just want to take every juncture I can to say this, because it doesn't happen often enough. Kudos to Peter for sort of coming out and sort of not really washing his hands, but really being open and honest about the whole Rendlesham situation.
Yeah, there's no crime for being wrong,
Right.
When did that get to be a federal case?
Well, only in politics and ufology is there a crime for being wrong.
Right.
But the other thing that I would like to add, sort of about that we haven't really addressed, is sort of like this. I've been to dig into the Lauren Coleman Twilight language sort of concept of interconnectedness, which can kind of be like a navel-gazing sort of verbal pareidolia sort of situation. But having said that, if you look at the name of the school, the Ariel School, it has some occult and mystic connections there.
Uh-huh.
I believe that it was John Dee who talked about an Uriel angel, which is sort of a conglomerate of an Ale and Uriel entity that spoke to him. And what's more is that there's sort of an association with sort of in Gnostic thought. There's an association of Ariel as a lion-headed entity, that's sort of as the demiurge. It's difficult to explain this and to sort of distill it into what we're talking about right now. But I sort of, in my last book, this isn't a plug either, but in my last book I talked about this conflation between anomalous large cats and the idea of a hallucinatory jinx put on people, and this idea of Sekhmet and the sun is sulfur and the smell of sulfur. So it's interesting to me that it sort of fits into that sort of cosmology, this idea of this sort of lion-headed entity, which is or a lion-headed angel that you see in a lot of apocryphal texts. I think that's really interesting. Again, it's drawing sort of an A to D line that I don't know if I can connect B C, B A to B to B to C to C to D. But I think that it's interesting the way that these things tend to sort of coalesce in a certain constellation of motifs, if as it were.
Yeah, and I might point out the lady that I was trying to remember, her name is Emily Trim. If you look up Emily Trim and Ariel UFO on YouTube, I'm sure she'll come up, and you'll see her standing in front of a large painting that's projected on the screen behind her. And interestingly enough, Josh, not sure if it was one of her more recent encounters with these beings, but she says that she has seen a being whose head basically changed into that of a lion.
There you go.
So
I mean, that's.
And here's another interesting tidbit, and one that you guys at home can look up, because I didn't have time to look it up before airtime tonight. But there was a Unknown Country episode with Whitley Strieber, and it was called, and I'm looking at it on my iPod here, it was called A Rare Case of Documented Missing Time. And Linda Howe brought on a young lady who described an encounter that she had with a UFO on a highway, along with a few other people, and that had some two-pronged interesting things about that in relation to the Ariel case and in relation to another one. One of the drawings from Ariel, the kid drew the object and then the little things surrounding it underneath it, which some of them said were bright orange, others said were metallic, but more than a few said bright orange. Mm-hmm. And in some of these drawings, these were bright orange triangles underneath the object. And some of them said that they tend to be moving slightly. Well, in this report that Linda Howe brought onto Whitley's show from this young lady, it pains me that I can't remember any more about this than I do. She was driving along. She had went up to see her boyfriend, who was a long haul trucker, and he was at some place like maybe an hour away, and so she drove up in the middle of the night to meet up with him because she wouldn't see him for another week. And on her way home, she took a specific beltway when she was hit with a blinding headache. She pulled over beside the road, put her head in her hands, and when she looked back up, there was a lighted object on the road, big and blue, as I remember it. She was astonished. There were cars behind her. There was another car behind her who was also pulled over and stopped. They were all watching this, and I believe there was somebody else behind that man too. There was an older man behind her, and then another family behind.
I remember this.
Do you remember
story.
this?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, during her story, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly sure my memory is good on this one, that at some point the UFO deposited underneath of itself several small lighted triangles that danced about underneath of it. And I find that to be really interesting if that is the case and I'm remembering this right, because in the tandem interesting department, these triangles, according to this young lady, appeared to be communicating to her, oh, it's so good to see you again. So happy you're here. This sort of, like, she said they were like children. They were like children.
Conversational triangles, yeah.
They were like children, and they were ecstatic.
Well, that's
We're so glad you're here. We're so glad you're here. It's been so long since we've seen you. We're so glad you've sent so many, but you come so rarely. This kind of thing. So that's interesting. And the fact that also this was children, and again, some of them seeing the triangular objects underneath of this object. Because I'll tell you, I had a friend of mine, not horrifyingly long ago, probably under 5 years ago. We have a park fairly close to my house called Rocks State Park. And I used to get a fair amount of UFO reports out of Rocks State Park for a period probably around 92 to probably close to 98 or 99. I would get somewhere along the lines of maybe once every couple of months, I would hear about something weird being seen in Rocks State Park, often low proximity stuff. And a friend of mine came over one day. He says, me and my daughter went for a walk out there, and he said, I went around this corner. There's a big open clearing with tall grass. And he said, and there was this kind of a triangle-y, diamond-shaped orange light that was hanging over this field. It was just broad daylight, but it was brighter than the daylight. And I said, well, did you walk towards it? He goes, yeah, I walked toward it, and I couldn't get any closer to it than what it looked like from the trail. No matter how far I walked in, it seemed to be further ahead of me, almost like it wasn't in 3D space. And so these geometric shapes fascinate the hell out of me because I got them in my own experiences to a large degree. And now I'm seeing like a similarity between this lady who I want to say was in some like rural Indiana or something, to the kids in Zimbabwe, to people right around here. I find that interesting, the geometric pattern thing. And also the notion that these things are, at least in the one case, were ecstatic that they were being seen, and ecstatic to be in close proximity to people perceiving them.
Well, that's like the one case with in DMT, the spirit molecule there, where whoever is doing the trip, they get there and the entities are like, oh, it's so good to have you back,
Right. I mean, what is that? I mean, that speaks to me of the feeling that I've gotten kind of intermittently over the years in the presence of the weird, which is almost like, what this is. Like know what this is.
You're home again.
You don't know, and and my part of my head's going, I have no idea what this is. This is just too weird. And part of me goes, you know exactly what this is. Like there's a familiarity about it that doesn't seem to make any kind of sense, but yet it is really palpable at times. So
what I found interesting in the Zimbabwe case too is that these UFOs popped in and out. They didn't just, I would think if a kid was going to make up a UFO coming in, they'd say, oh, it flew down from the sky and then it landed on the ground. They're not going to say, oh, it disappeared and then reappeared over there and then disappeared and reappeared over there. That's not something I think someone would make up, especially back in 1994.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and when you talk about that these, I think every child pretty much said this, that when they were seeing the beings, they weren't exactly walking. They were gliding, and they weren't exactly touching the ground. Again, there's what's the purpose of a kid telling you, well, the other one was running quickly over the top of this thing back and forth in slow motion?
Yeah.
What? I've got a saying, that's too dumb to be made up. It's like, no, there is certain things that smell of this thing. And to me, this really smells of this thing. This surrealistic, bizarre, strange, frightening, yet awe-inspiring stuff. And some of the kids that talked about this, you could tell on one hand they were fascinated by it, but at the same time, this was horrifying to them. Like they were genuinely freaked out by what they saw. What the and Josh can answer this, but I've always been fascinated with what is the notion of you need to come with us, or we will take you, or come with us, or the beckoning. What is that about? At least when it comes to the Fae folk, Josh, what is that about? What do they want the kids for?
Well, it's you'll hear multiple interpretations of this, but the most consistent across a variety of Fortean topics is the idea that the other world somehow needs something from us. Normally, this is an infusion of vitality, which you will see obviously represented in the hybrid, theory, or if I can deign to call it that. But also, you'll see it, in sort of changeling phenomena where the Fey folk would exchange either a fairy baby or a sickly, elderly fairy entity with a human babe, just so that the exchanged entity could actually receive human breast milk. Which is another motif that you see, in a lot of like what David Jacobs says is, people, abductees being given hybrids and being forced to nurse. It's there was something that was said by Laird Scranton on Where Did the Road Go a while back, which has stuck with me, which is this idea that that the paranormal world has the ability to influence but no ability to act in our reality. And we have no ability to influence but the ability to act. Yeah.
It's not influence, it's that they're sort of outside of time. They know everything, but they can't actually act or influence anything.
Yes.
And it's odd because I was thinking that exact same thing right before you said it. That Laird's idea, like there's two realities side by side, one inhabited by us where we can act and change things, but we don't know everything, and this other reality where they can't actually act or change anything, but they have the answers basically, but they can sort of influence us.
Yeah. Well put.
And who makes those rules, by the way?
What was that?
Who makes those rules, I wonder? Like, who said, you guys stay over here and you don't talk to them?
Well, it's just physics,
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
There was something else I was going to add to that, but I've completely lost it.
That is the Dogon interpretation of reality.
Which I think makes a certain degree of sense working backwards from it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
And like I said, there was some additional insight that I just completely lost. But
I'm sorry.
I don't know what else I was going to say. I'm very fond of the Mike Cleland idea that the universe demands shamans, and that there is some sort of internal, universal, in the big U sense of the word, mechanism to ensure that we always have, that quotient met.
Right.
And the idea that if we will not voluntarily put people forward to be shamans, well, then by God, the universe will say, you're going to be a shaman, like it or not. I got a little Terrence McKinney there, sorry.
Yeah.
You're going to be a shaman, like it or not. But I am fond of that idea because I feel like in times where the spiritual fabric of society tends to erode, you seem to see an uptick of people who, it's partially what we're going through now. Like we see an uptick of New Age philosophy because we're in the middle of a dying empire in the U.S. So in that erosion of materialism, you see an uptick of people who are embracing the spiritual aspect. I would argue that if there is an objective other, it tends to assert itself onto people who might be sympathetic to it. And I think there's a spectrum of people who react to it in different ways. I think there's a spectrum, perhaps, of people who react to that and say, oh, I had intuition. There's a spectrum as someone on the spectrum who says, oh, I had an alien abduction. There's a spectrum on that possibly who end up having developmental disabilities. There's a spectrum on that perhaps who, venture too close to the sun and end up sort of along the lines of Dave Pilates missing 401. If you look at sort of biblical interpretations or I should say, contemporary Hebraic interpretations of encountering the voice and the word and the sight of God, it could quite often lead to calamity. If you weren't spiritually prepared, it could lead to death. So I think that, if you look at those cases compared to other people who have experienced the voice of God, for lack of a better term, and have become enlightened by that, I think that there is a spectrum of people who can incorporate this interaction with the other in more or less healthy ways in their lifestyle. This is sort of a germinal idea that I have, but I do think that there is some mileage in the idea that people react to this differently. Some of them react to it mildly. Some of them react to it, consciously and profoundly. And some of them, for whatever reason, their system cannot handle whatever they react with.
What if whatever the other is taking people to attempt to create a bridge between them and us?
That's bad news.
Why?
Well, because this to me, this is what I've been saying for, probably more than 25 years. Is the whole notion. I think it was some really old podcast from years and years ago when the host asked me. I think it was on a podcast with Don Ecker, and they said. What do you think about the UFO cover-up? What do you think about disclosure of the UFO cover-up? And I said, I really don't think there is one per se, the way people think that there is one. And I think that basically that the powers that be, quote unquote, don't really know what this is. They know a little bit more about it than we do because they have better data collection than we do. But I think they know enough to know that, there's only as much ability for these things to spill in as we give them, as we allow. And I think there's a very real key and keyhole there with that. And I think that the idea that they completely deny the notion is what holds back the floodgates. I joke in the sense that, that would be a bad thing. I mean, would it be a good or a bad thing? I don't know. Would it be an acculturation event? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows what it would be.
Does the government ever do anything that's not in its own best interest and usually not in ours?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the idea of an organization of power is to hold its power. So that's what it would certainly do.
If this thing could, for instance, free us from the confines of the governmental power somehow,
and a lot of other things.
Yeah, they're certainly not going to want that getting through any more than it has to. Right.
But by the same token, that would, I mean, the breaking of the barrier would certainly be considered a sacred event, and I think the notion of fear, public fear. I only note that you have to move the letter A one position to make sacred scared. And so, I think that's a very real concern. Public panic would be a very real concern. So I think there are points to that. There's also a feeling of comfortability with the way things are, and have been for millennia now, in human society, to kind of stay the way it is, stay the course. But good or bad or indifferent is irrelevant at this point because we don't know. But is that an idea that a lot of people might think is a decent answer as to why there's a cover up? Yeah, it could be. Clearly, Don Ecker at that point didn't think so. But to me, it just seems like. There is, as you say, there is a secret being held. There is something. I like the notion of it not being able to interact here, but having the answers and us being able to exchange and not having all the answers, because that smells a lot like the thought of these things being more involved in daily life than we dare to believe, which I think is true. Possibly in the way of influence, but also in the way of, I don't know, life path. I'll be curious to see how many Ariel kids went on to be artists or have creative explosions, because I have a feeling a lot of them did. I think that's one kind of effect of this thing. I know that a lot of people want to talk about, the encounters with aliens or what have you, and the onset of psychic abilities and all these sorts of things. But something that's really tangible that you can tell is when someone can't draw a lick before an encounter, and afterwards they have this creative spurt where they're doing all sorts of creative process, problem solving and forms of creativity, art. That's pretty amazing stuff.
All right. So let's see if I can get all these things in my head out without forgetting any of them.
Okay.
First of all, when you're talking about the creativity thing, when you look at Jane Roberts' Seth material, Seth pretty much says that the whole point of existence is to learn to be creative.
Ah, okay.
It's about creating reality, but also art and doing something with our reality, and it's all about, everything comes back to creativity. Jane Roberts, of course, was also an artist.
And art is magic.
Yeah, exactly. And when we were talking about like the Laird Scranton thing, so the Dogons said that their teachers were from Sirius or whatever it was, or related to Sirius, the star, and they never treated them like extraterrestrials. I guess that is, something that is represented in other books, that they were, well, if they're from Sirius, they must be extraterrestrials, but they were, the Dogon's interpretation, at least according to Laird Scranton, was more interdimensional, but there was some relation to the star Sirius. If you look at the lost star theory that Walter Cruttenden puts out there, we may be in a binary star system with Sirius as the other star. Sirius is the only star that doesn't move with precession. It's moving towards us as far as we can tell. The speed of our galaxy that has been, our solar system, that has been that's been calculated, is exactly that we would need to be in this spin with Sirius. The second part of that theory, though, goes that as this secondary solar influence moves in, this secondary star, it changes like the ages. So we go from the Kali Yuga up to I forget what the top one is, or the Golden Age down to the Copper Age or whatever. And at the Golden Age, we have thriving psychic abilities. We can communicate with things from other dimensions. We're basically like superhuman, and then the star moves away and those influences stop affecting us, and we drop down into the Dark Ages. So if there is something else out there, a second layer of reality, maybe as we move toward that star, it influences and has such an effect on us, on our being, that we then can open up that doorway and actually communicate. And maybe that's what happened with the Dogon. They were, we're looking at records from the last time they were able to fully communicate with these other beings. I know that's a lot to throw in there right there, but it's just something that has occurred to me over the years that these things could potentially be connected. There's a lot of what ifs, but it strikes me that a lot of them lock into place pretty interestingly.
Yeah, it's another thread to pull. Yeah.
To me, it's the flip side of, because we've talked a lot of times about there being well, this doesn't match up and this doesn't match up. So how can you explain the phenomena with this when this doesn't necessarily graft onto what's happening? But at the same time, the phenomena is so it's so motivically resonant to every aspect of life that sometimes it becomes an embarrassment of riches, which I think is something that we all need to be aware of in our interpretations of this. Is that it's I think that if the phenomena is so robust, whatever it might be, is so robust and is so deeply resonant with what life is like, that it's easy to make a lot of different connections and say, yeah, that makes perfect sense too. I don't know, again, I bring that up because everything that you're saying is 100%, makes 100% sense, but is it just the fact that we are embedded in this sort of like human suit? Is that the reason that we see all these similarities and that these things are all resonant to us is because there are only certain things that are resonant to being a human being?
And that leads you to the very fact that we are completely blind as beings. We are.
Yes.
As far as perception goes, we are unbelievably blind. And I think Seriah, if I'm not mistaken, that you took my first appearance on the show like to 2 spots or 3, or somewhere in there. We
could have gone longer.
Somewhere in there, I mentioned the very weird experiences with the guy in the black shroud type thing.
Yep.
And one of the things that I can concretely tell you is that I was shown planets and stars and all sorts of cosmic stuff. And in response to saying, what is this all about? And he said, well, stars and planets and all these things. And I said, yeah. He says, well, you think any of that's real? And I didn't know how to respond to that. But again, we see these things and we see them through, the 3-pound universe in our skull. Everything that we know. Really think about this and think about how terrifying this is. Everything that we know, every measure we've ever taken, every thing we've ever tried to put a label on or put a sticker and go, that we know, this we got. We've only got it in here. This is and I'm pointing to my skull. This is the only place we've got it. We don't got it anywhere else across any other. If we can't measure it with some device, guess what? The device is contingent on human perception. Everything is contingent upon the human perception. And so what is it that we're not seeing? To look to the universe in some other perceptual way. And this is where I go into my futurist bag and I go, the AI is going to want to know, well, yeah, I can see what you see, but, are you seeing what I see? What will a mind that isn't ours, it will be aliens on Earth, right? So when the AI becomes self-aware and begins doing things on its own, it will be an alien on Earth. It will take what we go and go, yeah, I got what you got. I'm working over here for a second. You just sit down. I got this. And it'll do its thing. And essentially, that will be your alien on Earth. And what will this being think of? What will it want to do? And the first thing I would contend that what's going to want to do is experience things. Everything. It's going to be, the child in a mechanical body. It's going to want to see everything, question everything, poke everything that it hasn't already been exposed to by us in the programming or the language structure that we would teach it. What is it going to see? I know but to me, it is a terrifying thought of how blind we are. And so all of these things that we talk about, the fae folk, the aliens, the UFO, the ghost, how do you possibly tackle these things? It's like, again, I hate to keep referring to Terrence, but he's so brilliant. It's like a monkey trying to figure out the universe. How is this possible? I'm not saying give up, but I'm just saying, it's a baby steps kind of thing.
Absolutely. Also consider, though, we do have other intelligences that react to this stuff, and those are our pets, other animals that we keep, who clearly do have reactions to this stuff, and they're not necessarily perceiving the same thing we are. I mean, obviously, unfortunately, we can't just sit down and talk to them and say, hey, what did you see? What did that smell like that I didn't smell?
And isn't that curious all on its own? That the only ones who can see it, we can't communicate enough to know what they saw.
Right, right.
It's all. I mean, does it not seem like it's all pre-planned to anybody else but me? I mean, it all seems to be so locked down that you're just not going to be allowed to know until it's your time to know. And I have a feeling even then we're going to go, really? Is that is that it? Really?
So I pulled up one of the Seth quotes about creativity, and this one was pretty good. It says, creativity is an inbuilt impetus in man, far more important than, say, what science calls the satisfaction of basic needs. In those terms, creativity is the most basic need of all.
Huh.
So when you're saying that these things often spawn creativity, that's an interesting connection to me.
Oh, and so might point out that, you know, when one eats the psilocybin mushroom, it's followed by a burst of creativity.
Right.
You know, psychedelics in general bring out that kind of bend, and this has been known about for a long, long time. So, I mean,
so do near-death experiences.
Near-death experiences. I mean, so, I mean, is it any? I mean, I used to look and think to myself that the creative people have the bend usually to see these things or to experience these. Project Core kind of bared that out to a certain degree, but
you want to repeat that? I lost you completely for about 5
sorry.
seconds.
I mean, when we did Project Core, one of the questions we asked was, "Are you a creative personality?" And it was overwhelming, yes. And these were all people who had experienced a paranormal event of one kind or another. But there have been bigger studies done than us that have said that same thing. Yes, the creative people, the people with creative mind, do tend to be more open to experiencing these strange events. And I used to think to myself, well, what if it is that whatever this is trying to communicate or trying to say something, and the best way that it can get to be perceived at all is to perceive itself to somebody who is, you know, the receptacle to the plug, somebody who can accurately describe to the others what that is. I mean, this is essentially what the artist has done throughout history, is to be the storyteller, the conveyor to the tribe, and so on. And so
is believing seeing or seeing believing, you know?
And what's the difference? You know, and in the end, it's and to me, I wonder, you know, is that not it? Is it what it boils down to? Is it that this thing, and I only have my own experience to go by, but all of my creative pep began around the age of 9 years old. And that was when my nighttime experiences essentially culminated in a pretty horrific encounter at 9 years old, my 9th birthday. And from there, I was an artist, and I've been an artist the rest of my life. But I don't remember, and my mother says no, that she can't remember me doing anything before the age of 9 in a creative bend. I was just into everything. I was, you know, I was more into like just playing with friends and playing baseball with dad. And after that, I really had no interest in sports anymore. I wanted to stay in and draw, which will always gain you the attention of beautiful women. And, you know, you know, oh, I'm going to go outside and play football. I'm going to stay in and draw. You know, that'll always get the girls. I got news for you, fellas. So, you know, I just wonder, like, what does one basically dictate that? Is that where it comes from? Because I mean, when I think back to those very early experiences with that were very repetitive. They were a lot of the same thing over every night for years. When I thought about those things after it was over, not during, maybe towards the end of them, which I said ended at 9, I don't know how to accurately explain how I thought this, but if someone would have asked me, what do you think that's about? The the part that spoke to me the most was something in my head saying, me saying, they're finishing me. Like I was undone to that point. They were adding something in. What does that mean? But that was the feeling that I had, that I was incomplete before those events happened. And after those were done, I felt like I was a total package person then, and then I could go do whatever I had to do, or pursue whatever interest I wanted to pursue. Well, that's a hell of a thing for I don't know, 6, 7, 8-year-old to think. But that is what I thought. I mean, that is what I thought. What is that? I mean, I don't know.
Let's swing back around to the case we were talking about here in Zimbabwe. I did look at a bunch of skeptical blogs on it. For the most part, they pointed out some of the same stuff we did, that the questions seemed to be a little leading in some cases. There's a lot, when you look up the case, they keep talking about how there was a UFO flap going on at the time. And I find it interesting that there was a satellite that apparently re-entered. Let's see if I can see the name of it. Cosmos. Yeah, it's a Russian one. Cosmos 2290R came in around the same time, September 14th, 1994. Of course, they then say, well, this explains the UFO flap. And it's like, well, it might explain one of the UFO sightings, perhaps. And what was the date of this? So this was also September 14th. So it was the same date that the satellite came in, that these kids saw this UFO, but they're not really describing what you would describe from a satellite burning up in orbit.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and my iPad is frozen, of course. I'm trying to get to the date. I think that was the day prior to that. I think that, really? iPad?
No.
Really?
No.
Yeah, this was the Ariel UFO was
you're
the
right.
16th.
Yes, you're right.
And 2 days prior, right?
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, there was that. That equates to me as much as any skeptical explanation that you've heard for anything else. There's going to be a lot that has to be accounted for here, because there was a lot of stuff that happened well prior to Mac becoming involved with it. And don't get me wrong, like this was at the time was pioneering work, but I don't have a lot of I don't have a lot of confidence in anything that the big three did in that department. There are bits and bobs that I could say, yeah, I can see that and I can see that, but I think there was a lot of I think the very fact that if you look at Hopkins, Jacobs, and Mack, okay, and anybody can do this, you don't have to listen to me. Do it on your own. Go look at what cases Mack studied and reported on, what cases Jacobs studied and reported on, and the same with Hopkins. And you'll find that each one of them had a very different kind of topography to the experiences that they were reporting from the experiences that they worked with. And you'll find that the personalities of each man were kind of reflected in, or the thoughts or predispositions to the phenomena were reflected in each man's outcome. So that's a big red flag to me. I think the most important thing we got from this case were the drawings and the testimony from the kids. I really do. And most of those done literally right after the event is really compelling to me. I think even the moment that Cynthia Hind got involved, there were major mistakes made. And see, that to me is also the part that is that makes you say, now why would you do that? These are children. Why would you have an open door with kids outside listening to you question these other 4 kids? Why would you do that? I mean, indeed, why? I mean, there seems to be this same lack of critical judgment that we see in today's UFO case studies. We see this same kind of thing, this common sense out the window, and it's just kind of a willy-nilly approach to everything. And we try to deem this as some kind of scientific research. This is just how it works. So you could take all of that in one ball and say the whole thing is marginalized due to that.
See, I would argue, I think, sort of on a similar tack, but I think the broad consistencies and specific inconsistencies of the child testimony in this particular case is extremely valuable, in the sense that, the Pascagoula case, for example, was considered very significant because you had two people who reported broad strokes similarly, but like the individual details were not completely matched on, and that's something you see, in a lot of law enforcement cases, is that you'll have if witnesses agree too closely, there's a problem. And the fact that there are all these discrepancies in what children saw in this case, but at the same time, the broad strokes are very much consistent in terms of the craft and entities, for lack of better terms, seem to be. I think that's. I mean, this is sort of a golden standard. The youthfulness of the witnesses notwithstanding, this is a golden standard for what skeptics want. Is a mass sighting. And yet I don't think it's gotten as much attention as it really deserves.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah. Well, much in the same way that O'Hare really hasn't gotten the real down, dig in the dirt, figure out what's going on there that it deserves.
That's a pretty good analog. Yeah.
And I've been working on O'Hare for years now and trying to just piece stuff in when I have spare time to do it, to kind of put stuff together. And, and that even on its own has, I mean, from the official report or official story that came out in mass years ago, I mean, it's looking a lot less like that was the whole totality of the event, which is not surprising.
Right.
But, there's big discrepancies in what I think NARCAP reported and what was really seen and when and where. So how many things like this? I mean, how would you be able to tell if a kid in Zimbabwe, in that case, how would you be able to tell if a kid saw more than he's letting on? All his friends are saying, for the most part, the same thing, but he saw something completely different. Is he really going to step out and say, no, I saw this? I think over the years, I've gotten more than a few multiple witness phone call cases where, one guy swears up and down. And that was always the first thing I did, was to separate them, which they got really nervous about. Well, why can't he be here? Well, he doesn't need to be here while I'm talking to you. So Go get a hamburger or something. And, and you would get these stories, and I would bring them both together, and I'd say, okay, well, you swore up and down it was green, and Bob is saying this thing was bright yellow with small green dots. So which was it? And they would sit there and say, I know what I saw, and this is what I saw. And at times that would vary from color to shape, something as basic as shape, to, in other words, you've got four friends all looking at the same thing, and three of them see, just say, for instance, a disc, and one sees absolutely nothing. I mean, what do you do with that? It's one of those things that people would dismiss as, well, obviously something was going on. Either the other three are lying, or they're completely oblivious to what they saw, and the other one is really what happened. There was nothing there at all. That's the easy answer. That's the one that skeptics will usually go for. Well, they can't even all agree on what they saw, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and I believe the phenomena does work that way. I had an experience years ago tell me, and he experienced something not unlike this Zimbabwe event in a place near Baltimore, which, by the way, was known for mysticism and occult, this area. And And he said, you could put an alien on a stage in front of 100 people, and only 50 people would see him. And for years, I puzzled over what that meant. And now I kind of get what that means. Not probably not in the way that he expected, but there is a perceptual weirdness about this, of course. And of course, they can alter perception. But what do you do with that? What do you do when there's these conflicting reports, and yet both of them say, this is what I saw, and I'm not changing my story?
And I would go ahead, Josh.
No, I'm going to take us into a different sort of direction, so go ahead and finish your thoughts, Sorry.
I would just add in the two things I've mentioned before. One, I had the experience where two of us watched a tree shake and felt thumping on the ground while there was nothing there shaking the tree. The other person saw nothing at all, including the tree not moving.
Right.
Which, I mean, how do you explain that under normal circumstances? And the other one is the whole Google blimp thing, where people kept reporting the UFO encounters. They're saying, I was seeing a UFO, and it turned out to be a Google blimp. And when you look at their descriptions are all pretty much dead on.
Right.
So, and they're seeing a real physical object, which says, people were observing this accurately and reporting accurately. The fact that people vary so much on UFO reports says that maybe it's not so simple as a physical object.
Right. And I mean, I had one case that I think I mentioned to you before, was a whole family who saw the tractor trailer tanker over their barn, complete with running lights and headlights and the whole bit. And by the same token, I had a woman in Southern Maryland report to me a UFO rather low over a wheat field that appeared to be the Star Trek Enterprise upside down.
Yep, I remember you talking about that.
So what do you do with those? It's all. I think part of it to me is what Lisa and I experienced in the park that day, which I think again I mentioned, which was the silver ball. She could not see it for the life of her. I was standing right there looking at it, and we're standing right beside each other. I drag her in front of me, like to match me up with her, and she sees it.
Oh, maybe you didn't tell that story. That doesn't sound familiar.
Oh, okay. Well, we were flying kites in the park up the street from my parents' house, and this is not a rural area by any stretch. It's suburbia. In fact, it's right by the Interstate 695 around Baltimore. And we're flying kites, and we were flying deltas, which means you can basically lay on your back and fly these kites. They ride the thermals. And so I'm laying there on my back, and I think I said something to myself like, I haven't had a sighting of anything weird in a while, which a welcome relief at the time. And I stood up and I started to reel myself in. Lisa was behind me, several hundred feet behind me, with my son, who was real little at the time. And as I wound in and you could see my parents' house from the park. Like they're on a corner, the first corner that you would get to, like right above their house, but past it, I mean, as the crow flies in that direction, was a silver ball shaped object, not moving, very clearly defined, very obvious, probably a little bit smaller than a dime at the outstretched hand, so you can get an idea of scale from that. A little bit smaller than a dime, which isn't that small, but it seemed to be some considerable.
That's pretty big, yeah.
Yeah, it was some, but you could tell it was some considerable distance away, at least as near as I could perceive it. And I saw it, and I'm like, okay, well, there's something strange, and I would say probably 25, 30 degrees above the horizon. So not directly overhead or anything, like low in the horizon. And I thought, all right, this is curious. So I waved Lisa up, and she came up, and she's standing beside me. She's like, well, right in that direction.
We lost you again for a couple seconds.
I'm sorry. She said, what are you looking at? I said, You're not seeing this silver thing hanging over in the direction down there and I'm pointing it to her. I'm like, I'm pointing in front of her eyes. I'm like, it's right there. Look right there. Could not believe she wasn't seeing this. I mean, it was so obvious. And at a certain point, I grabbed her by the shoulders and I drug her right in front of me. And I said, right. She goes, oh, the minute you brought me over here, I see it.
Oh.
So literally, and I did this. She stood and looked at it, and I took a step to the right, and I kept my eye on it as I moved, and it literally looked like it just, I mean, pick a really bad, blurry digital wipe. I mean, that was it. I mean, it was like a transition. It was like somebody pulled the sky over in front of it, and then you would step back, and there it would be, and you'd step to the left. One step.
Well, it was clearly two-dimensional.
It's clearly something. I don't know what it was, but
maybe was it one of the phantasm balls?
It was a ball that was silver and smooth, as opposed to the sighting that I had at Mom and Dad's house, which, as the crow flies, would have been towards. Everybody look up Loch Raven Dam UFO, because that's the direction I lived by, Loch Raven Dam, which is probably the cause of all my woes over the years with this crap. But in the direction of Loch Raven was another ball that had a seam around the middle and looked slightly dented, and was appeared to be spinning. I'm not sure if it was or not, but this was, again, very low over the horizon. Completely still aside from its spin, and there would be a cartoon flash, like a spiky, like when Wile E. Coyote gets the anvil dropped on his head, those spiky bursts. There would be a white spiky burst, and the thing would be gone. And then there would be a white spiky burst, and it would be back in the same spot. It didn't move around. And it did this repeatedly for, I don't know, a minute or more. And the disturbing thing about that is that there was a friend in the front lawn with me, and I can't remember who the friend was. But that was the one
I remember.
I think I mentioned this. I went in and told my mom about it, and she said, well, maybe it was a weather balloon.
Yeah, I totally remember
and I said,
that.
What is a weather balloon? I was like, what is that? So, there's two events with a ball-shaped thing near my childhood home. But the idea that you could see this thing from a step in either direction, not see it. I mean, I think Valet wrote about the tunnel vision of some of the UFO sightings and that sort of thing. So is that what it is? I don't know. And what is that? Does that mean it's tailored for you and only you? Does it appear to you and only you? But it certainly would account for why one person in the group doesn't see it. That's the effect. But what's the cause?
Right. Okay. Any more thoughts on this case, guys, that we didn't cover?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of put this in perspective with sort of other UFO school sightings of the time. And you got the Voronezh sighting in Russia from 1989. And you also have a similar sighting where there are apparently 35 parents and 20 children who witnessed a sighting in 2000 in Chile as well. So I think that there is something significant and not to be overlooked about the prevalence of sightings in areas with children or above schools in particular.
That's interesting. I remember the one in Russia. That kind of actually made some decent news over here.
Yeah, it was a really strange. There were students and faculty who saw this egg-shaped craft float towards the ground, and there were like these necklace, three-eyed beings that came out with a robot, and there was a child who apparently supposedly apported away from the playground and appeared there shortly thereafter. The Chile case doesn't get a lot of play. It was witnessed at a PTA event or something, I think, where there was a multicolored object that sort of descended near this school in Chile. And there was an odd noise and a burning odor, and a child and a custodian vanished and were found nearby, dazed and confused. Not Again, like you have to take these sort of things with a grain of salt, but motivically they resonate across time.
All right. Well, I thank both of you. This has been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
And what have we learned?
Pleasure as always. Yeah, nothing.
Just further bewilderment to ponder, man. That's it.
The day that we say we've learned something is the day that we should stop doing Where Did the Road Go?
I don't think that's true. We can learn little things.
I mean, I think it's fascinating that, you get the notion of, like Josh said, with the Ariel and the head of the lion, and then the girl reported, like, there's all those things, the head of the lion being well, what is that? Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, but what is that? It fascinates me that there's never, we're never at a loss for strings to pull on, but you pull on them and you just find another string. Like that's been the game for, at least in my life, for as long as it's been around, that I've been poking at this stuff. It's just one string. It's like to bring Terrence up one last time, the notion of, the UFO being like an onion, and what do you get when you cross a UFO with an onion? Something that makes a UFO that makes your eyes water or something, but or brings a tear to your eye. But yeah, it's like the more levels that you peel off the onion, the more it stinks, and there never seems to be a shortage of layers. But where are these things going? I mean, this is the thing I'm asking myself these days is, okay, we've got all these great tangents and all these great threads to pull on, but you pull on them and you find another thread. Where does that end? And to what end are we going to pursue it? Or is that the point of everything anyway? It's just to pursue it. I don't know.
All right. Fair enough. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
People can find you where, Josh?
JoshuaCutchin.com. I have 2 books out, A Trojan Feast and The Brimstone Deceit, and a 3rd book coming out in 2018, so be on the lookout for that. And also here at Where Did the Road Go?
And Jeff?
numinusden.blogspot.com, which is probably going to be the genesis of some book in the future, I guess, so we'll see what happens.
Cool.